Orla Guerin, BBC News, Tel Aviv.
Well, let's now bring in global affairs analyst and senior fellow at the Atlantic Council, Michael Bociurkiw, who joins us live from Toronto. Thank you so much for joining us on Newsday. Firstly, what do you expect to happen? Are you hopeful that this deal for 4 days, would it hold?
Well, good to be with you. I noticed the Israeli officials are keeping expectations very low. They said nothing is official until it actually happens. I noted that the release of the hostages will happen in waves. And this is what we call in diplomacy, humanitarian aid business, kind of confidence building measures. Each side will see if they're living up to the agreements, and then more will follow. But we're talking about 50 in all, perhaps as many as 80, if you believe the Israeli press. There's a long way to go, but it's got to be said. I mean, I spent a lot of time recently in Israel, and everywhere you go, Marika, you could see the pressure, the campaigns on the Netanyahu government to bring these hostages home. So it's very, very important for Mr. Netanyahu, who's on very thin political ice right now, for this to work.
I do want to ask you about hostages as well, but before that, how much do you think the US has leaned on Israel to agree to this temporary ceasefire that they were initially very reluctant to?
Oh, enormously. I mean, from the start, the U.S. has been in the driver's seat on this. They have enormous sway over Israel. And I think it's been felt in Washington that the images coming out of Gaza are absolutely horrendous. This is a humanitarian catastrophe that we haven't seen in modern times. You know, people like me are lost for words to describe what we're actually seeing in Gaza. So enormous political pressure on the White House to make Israel, make that pause happen, and for that humanitarian aid to get in, because the death toll is absolutely enormous. So is the destruction.
On the hostages, as you mentioned, 50 out of possibly more than 200 who have been held. While there are skeptics, there are also hopes that this truce could be extended with more hostages released after 4 days. But one could argue that once Hamas frees all its hostages, it would lose its leverage. So what is likely to happen here?
Yeah, it's a very complicated situation, and I believe there are also hostages that are held by other non-state parties in Gaza as well. We don't know how many hostages have possibly been killed in the bombing. That's been a big concern of the families as well. But we also have to remember that on the other side, the Palestinian side, there's no lack of Palestinians in Israeli prisons that can be chosen to be released. You'll recall the detainment of that Israeli soldier many years ago. And in return for him, after I think about 5 years, they released several hundred Palestinian detainees. So it's very, very complicated. But I think the kind of positive aspect here is Qatar is involved. They have very good relations with Hamas. They are able to talk face to face with the Israelis and with the Americans. So they were very, very key to this.
Michael, you mentioned this, but other factions like Palestinian Islamic Jihad, who also hold hostages and say they won't be releasing them. Can you just talk us through what their role in all this are?
Well, the problem there is that I don't think they're in very good communication, for example, with the Palestinian Authority, with the Israelis. So these are outliers who are very, very violent. One scenario, I think it is a distant one, but it could happen because of all the death and destruction as well, is the actual residents of the Gaza Strip, once the aid starts flowing, once their lives start returning to normal, will maybe think about who is governing them and who has been one of the triggers in what they're seeing happen today. We've already seen in some video clips the Gaza residents of Gaza complaining about Hamas and that they're to blame for everything that's happening. So that'll be interesting to watch as well.
Michael Bociurkiw from the Atlantic Council, thank you so much for joining us on the program.
My pleasure.
Meanwhile, in the last few hours, there have been violent scenes in the Irish capital Dublin, with police clashing with protesters near the scene over multiple stabbing. Police condemned what they called a lunatic faction driven by far-right ideology. A woman and 3 young children were hurt in the knife attack, and a man who was arrested is being treated for serious injuries. Sarah Gavin has more.
Tonight, Dublin has been witness to violent clashes between rioters and police. Vehicles have been set alight, smoke seen rising from the city.